The rain had just started to fall again when I found them. 3 newborn kittens curled beneath the wreckage of an old barn roof, their mother lying still a few feet away, already cold. I hadn't planned on bringing anything home that morning, but fate has a way of making space in your hands before your heart understands why. My name is Levan, and I live halfway up a forested slope where the land doesn't care for easy answers. A year ago, I released a wounded falcon back into the sky. I never imagined she'd return, and I certainly didn't expect what happened next. I brought the kittens home wrapped in the inside of my coat. Their tiny bodies barely stirred, too cold to cry, too small to understand the world had shifted beneath them. My cabin isn't much, just stone, wood, and the old smell of smoke and moss, but it's warm. I tucked them into a wool-lined basket near the stove, set out goat milk in a dropper, and whispered to them like they were children waking from a bad dream. Ani arrived that evening with fresh bandages and her usual whirlwind of questions. "Uncle Levan, are you seriously keeping 3 newborns here? Do you even know how to bottle feed a cat?" I didn't, but I nodded anyway. Something about their presence filled the silence I'd been living in for years. 2 days passed. The smallest kitten, Mimsy, wasn't gaining weight. Her siblings, Zuri and Nino, mewled stronger with each feeding, but she just curled up and shook. Annie worried. I pretended not to. I told her nature would take its course, though I sat up that night, keeping watch like a soldier at a child's bedside. And that's when I saw her. Perched silently on the windowsill, feathers soaked from the night rain, Tari, my falcon. She stared at the basket, then at me. Her yellow eyes didn't blink. I hadn't seen her in nearly a year, and yet there she was, unmoving in the dark. I stepped toward her, slow, and without sound, she spread her wings and didn't fly away. I opened the window cautiously, expecting her to take off. But Tari didn't move, just dipped her head, slow and deliberate, as if asking permission. I stepped aside, unsure if I was losing my grip on reason. She stepped in. Annie nearly dropped the formula bottle when she saw the falcon hop onto the windowsill and perch just inches from the kitten's basket. "Uncle, are you out of your mind?" She hissed, backing away, arms protectively around the kittens. "That's a wild predator. She eats things like them." But Tari didn't strike. She just watched. Hours passed, then days. Each morning, Tari returned to that same windowsill. Sometimes she brought little twigs, sometimes nothing. Once, she dropped a feather next to the basket. Zuri hissed at her. Mimsy didn't react. I'd never seen a bird of prey act like this. Ani started recording the visits, whispering theories into her phone for a class project she hadn't planned to have. "This is imprinting behavior," she muttered, "or some sort of misplaced maternal instinct. Maybe she thinks they're her chicks." Meanwhile, Dito, the neighbor, found out. He marched up to the cabin, finger raised. "You're gonna wake up to feathers and fur everywhere, Levan. That bird's not your friend. Wild is wild." I didn't know what to say. He wasn't wrong. But the falcon hadn't left, and the kittens were still alive. And Mimsy had started moving again. It was on the 6th morning that Mimsy vanished. She'd been the quiet one, always curling against her siblings, barely strong enough to cry. But that morning, the basket was missing its smallest shape. I searched the cabin 3 times over, under the stove, behind the woodpile, even in my boots. Nothing. Annie was already panicking. "You think, Tari? No, she wouldn't." But the silence between us said what we didn't want to say. A falcon is still a falcon, no matter how gentle it seems. Then I saw it, on the ridge just beyond the tree line, a flash of gray-white fur, low in a nest of dried leaves. Tari was there, wings folded at her sides, and Mimsy was alive. The kitten was lying on a bed of feathers, not torn, not harmed, just sleeping, belly gently rising and falling. Tari stood guard like a sentry, not flinching even when I approached. I crouched, heart pounding like I was approaching a sleeping lion, but Mimsy stirred, yawned, and nuzzled into the falcon's breast. I called softly, and Tari stepped aside, not away, just over, as if granting me access. I lifted Mimsy, and she mewed, eyes half open. Ani gasped when she saw us come down the slope. Mimsy cradled against my chest, falcon following silently overhead. I didn't have an explanation, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I needed one. Ani stood in the doorway, eyes wide as the falcon landed silently behind me, her feathers still damp with early mist. The kitten in my arms stirred softly, stretching with a delicate arch of her back, completely at ease, as if she hadn't spent the night tucked beneath the breast of a bird meant by nature to devour her. The warmth in that moment made the cold air around us feel unreal, as if the mountain itself had held its breath to witness something sacred. Ani didn't speak right away. Her lips parted slightly, caught between disbelief and wonder, but her hands reached out instinctively to cradle Mimsy. She studied her. No bites, no scratches, no panic in the tiny frame. Only peace. A slow, careful peace. Later that night, the fire burned low and we sat without the need for words. Outside the window, Tari remained perched near the basket where Zuri and Nino now slept, her silhouette sharp against the pale sky, unmoving yet not threatening. Ani finally broke the silence, her voice subdued, almost reverent. She spoke not like a student of veterinary science, but like someone realizing the rules she'd learned may only be part of a greater, older truth. "I don't think this is instinct," she said quietly. "It's something else. Something chosen." I wanted to disagree, to call it projection, myth, foolishness. But in my chest, I felt something shift. This wasn't a rescue anymore. This was something far stranger. A story we hadn't been trained to understand. Word travels differently in a village like ours, sometimes slower than a whisper, sometimes faster than the wind. And by the end of the week, half the hillside knew about the Falcon and her kittens. Dito returned, this time with 2 men and a rusted cage, claiming he'd spoken to someone at the local forestry office who'd confirmed that peregrines weren't just protected, but dangerous. He stood outside my cabin with his hand resting on the cage's door, like a hunter trying to look like a concerned citizen. His voice was calm, but his eyes were lit with something else. Fear, maybe, or a stubborn belief that what didn't make sense had to be made right by force. "Levan," he said, "you've got a predator living with prey. If you won't end it, someone else might." Ani stood beside me, tense as a coiled rope, her jaw clenched tight. Inside, the kittens mewed softly, and Tari, perched on the wooden beam above the door, watched the men with a stillness more unnerving than any shriek or screech. She didn't move, didn't blink, but the message was clear. This was her territory now, and somehow we were part of it. That night, I heard a car slowing on the gravel road, headlights flashing once through the trees before disappearing again. No one came to the door, but the tension had taken root. We were no longer alone in this story. The world outside wanted its rules restored, and none of them had room for what was happening inside our cabin. The question pressed heavier with each passing day, though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. Were we keeping them safe, or just delaying the inevitable? The Falcon, despite every instinct I thought I understood, had shown no aggression, only presence, ritual, devotion. And yet, a voice inside me kept whispering warnings I couldn't silence. Not because I feared her, but because I feared what might come next. When the kittens grew stronger, would she still see them as hers? Or would nature, like some ancient clock, reassert itself in one sudden, irreversible moment? Ani, curled near the stove one evening, finally asked the thing that lived in both of us. What happens if she doesn't want to let them go? Her voice was soft, but the question landed like a stone. We were nursing them towards survival, but with each heartbeat they gave to Tari, they were also being rewired, bonded not to humans, but to something wild and winged and unknowable. I didn't have an answer, only more questions. Was I willing to raise them? Could I let them go if it meant breaking their bond? Or worse, could I bear keeping them if it meant separating them from the only mother they'd truly accepted? It happened just after a storm passed through, the kind that leaves behind fog like breath frozen in the trees. I stepped outside at dawn to check on the slope where Tari often took flight, her silhouette usually visible above the broken tree line. But that morning she wasn't there. I waited, coffee cooling in my hands, the sky lightening in layers. Nothing. Inside, the kittens mewed restlessly. Zuri paced the edge of the basket with a growing impatience I hadn't seen before, and Nino hissed when I tried to pick him up. They weren't just growing, they were changing, more alert, more anxious. Mimsy cried softly for the first time in days, her tiny head twisting toward the window with something like longing. By noon, there was still no sign of Tari. Ani walked the ridge with binoculars, scanning treetops and cliff faces. I called her name more times than I cared to admit. Dido showed up again that evening, smug in the silence. See? She's gone. She was never meant to stay. But I wasn't sure if she'd left or if something had happened. That night, I found a small clump of feathers near the old fence line, too close to the ground, too quiet in their arrival. They were black-edged, with streaks of ash and bronze, undeniably hers. My stomach twisted. Something had changed, and the kittens knew it before we did. Tari wasn't just missing. She might be in danger. And suddenly, everything we'd built was on the verge of unraveling. The forest had gone quiet in her absence. It's strange how silence can make a place feel unrecognizable. For days, the usual rhythm of birdsong and breeze felt hollow, as if something sacred had been pulled from its center. The kittens responded in ways that startled us. Zuri refused to eat unless Ani held her, staring at the empty windowsill as though willing Tari to return. Nino hissed at the wind and paced as if waiting for a fight. And Mimsy, sweet, slow Mimsy, barely moved at all, her tiny breath shallow, her eyes dull. It was as if without the falcon's watchful presence, the threads holding her together had begun to loosen again. Ani took it hardest. Her calm, clinical instincts gave way to restless movement. She stayed up late, flipping through old notes, calling professors who couldn't give her answers. She even reached out to Nugzar, the old falconer who lived in the next valley, retired, half-blind, and known for being as prickly as a thistle bush. He came the next afternoon, leaning on a carved walking stick, his eyes pale but sharp beneath brows. He stood in the cabin center without saying a word, just listening. Finally, he muttered, "She imprinted on loss, not prey." His voice was gravel. She saw death in the kittens and gave them her own name for life. That night, as I sat outside with a lantern burning low, something shifted in the air. The trees hushed. The wind stilled. Then one single cry, sharp and familiar, echoing across the ridge. Tari was back. She descended like a shadow-given form, wings wide, talons clenched around something small. A rabbit, freshly caught. She dropped it near the door and looked at me, then at the basket inside. She had come not just to visit, but to provide. Tari's return did something to the rhythm of our days, revived something, yet unsettled everything at once. She was no longer a silent observer. Each morning she brought something to the door. Sometimes a vole, sometimes a scrap of bark, once even a strip of white cloth I recognized from one of Ani's torn shirts on the laundry line. She was building again, something unseen, something invisible, and the kittens responded in kind. Mimsy perked up, Zuri purred for the first time, and Nino began curling against the beam where Tari often perched, mewling toward her like a child calling to its mother. But the pressure outside was mounting. Dido had gone beyond warnings. He'd filed a formal report with the regional office, and a letter arrived folded tight and damp in our mailbox. It warned of risks, of wildlife interference, of unnatural bonds that may compromise the health of all animals involved. The language was cold, detached, clinical, but its intent was clear. We were being told kindly, officially, but undeniably, that the falcon had to go, and the kittens needed to be rehomed or placed in foster care. Annie stared at the letter for a long time, then quietly folded it in half and tucked it behind the firewood basket. She didn't say a word. That night, we sat in the dim orange glow of the hearth, kittens curled between us, Tari watching from the sill. I looked at Ani. "We can't keep them all," I said. She nodded. "But how do we separate them?" And there it was, the question we'd both feared. To do what was right by law or by love, to follow the rules we were raised with, or trust something ancient and tender that had grown without permission. The next morning arrived with a grayness that seemed stitched into the sky, the kind of dull overcast that smothered color and made every sound feel heavier. We sat at the small kitchen table, Ani stirring tea she wouldn't drink, her eyes locked on the open crate by the door. It was the same crate Tari had first arrived in, a year ago, when I'd rescued her with a torn wing from the cliffs above the river bend. We'd kept it all this time, stored behind the shed like a relic of a past we thought we'd buried. Now, it waited again. Only this time, not for rescue, but for release. "I called the shelter," Ani said, her voice barely audible. "They said they could take the kittens tomorrow. Separate fosters, but they're good people." She didn't look at me, just kept staring at the crate, her fingers motionless on the teaspoon. "They'll be safe." Outside, Tari circled once overhead, then landed on the roof, talons scraping softly across the stone as she shifted in place. Below her, Zuri let out a small mew and pawed at the window. It had become routine, the falcon above, the kittens below, a rhythm of longing, as if both sides knew their time together was shrinking. I opened the window. Tari dipped her head in that strange, reverent way of hers. Not submission, not goodbye, but something in between, an acknowledgement that this thing we had built together could not stay untouched forever. Dido returned that evening with the letter in hand. "You've had your miracle," he said, not unkindly. "But now you have to decide. Wild belongs to wild. You taught me that, Levan." And I had. I just never expected it would hurt so much to believe it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin felt too still, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from the weight of something unresolved. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters, carrying with it the faint rustle of feathers and pine. Tari hadn't returned to the windowsill. The kittens curled tightly in their basket, Mimsy's tiny chest rising and falling like the ticking of a fragile clock. I sat in the doorway, legs pulled close, watching the sky shift from ink to slate. When dawn finally arrived, I went to the clearing behind the cabin, the one where Tari used to train her wings after her recovery. And there she was, perched on the twisted stump near the ridge, her wings half unfurled like she'd been caught mid-prayer. She didn't fly, just watched me approach with those ancient eyes that had seen things I'd never understand. I knelt beside the stump, not speaking, not moving. Behind me, I heard the soft patter of paws. All three kittens, Zuri leading, Nino wobbling behind, Mimsy trying her best to keep up, had followed me. They made their way to Tari without hesitation, rubbing against her talons, pressing their bodies into her feathers as if drawn by some invisible tether. In that moment, the decision we dreaded felt almost irrelevant. We were no longer choosing between what was allowed and what was right. We were standing in the middle of something older than rules, older than rescue. A truth written not on paper, but in instinct and trust and the wild language of the heart. Behind me, Ani stood in silence. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She just knelt beside me, wrapped her arms around Zuri, and whispered, "So what do we do now?" I didn't answer. I didn't know yet. The next morning came with a stillness so complete, it felt unnatural. The forest held its breath. No wind, no birdsong, just a hush that seemed to stretch between the earth and the sky. I rose before the sun, heart already aching with the knowledge that something had to end. We couldn't live like this, not forever. Not with threats from the outside closing in, not with nature bending under the strain of something so strange and so sacred. Ani and I packed a small crate with food, bedding, and cloth that smelled like the basket. The kittens, now nearly weaned, squirmed less than before, but they still looked back at us every few steps we took away from the cabin. Tari flew low overhead, her flight slower than usual, as though she too understood that what came next would fracture the bond we'd all nurtured together. We hiked to the old Falconer's Glen, Nugzer's suggestion, a protected stretch of wildland, off the books and forgotten by most, tucked between two ridges and lined with old hunting blinds and natural shelter. We left the crate there, open, facing east. Tari landed beside it and looked at us, not with challenge or fear, but with an understanding so deep it ached to see it reflected in her eyes. The kittens didn't cry. They climbed into the crate on their own. We stepped back. Tari spread her wings once, and without fanfare, tucked herself beside them. We left them there, not abandoned, not caged, but entrusted to a space that might let them belong to both worlds, wild and yet loved. Annie cried as we walked back. I didn't. Not then. But as the forest swallowed the path behind us, I knew a part of us would always remain in that glen, held between talons and tiny paws. Weeks have passed since we last saw them, Tari and the kittens, nestled somewhere beyond the ridgeline where the trees grow thicker and human feet don't often wander. The shelter never called again. The forestry letter faded under a pile of papers I never bothered to file. Dido stopped visiting. Nugzar came once more to check on us, said nothing, only nodded toward the mountain, then walked back into the trees like a man who'd seen something sacred and didn't need it explained. Ani returned to the city with more questions than answers, and a project her professors didn't know how to grade. She left behind a stack of notebooks and a note that read, "Some bonds aren't supposed to make sense. They're just meant to be honored. As for me, I still watch the sky every morning. Sometimes I catch a glimpse, wings against the light, a silhouette pausing on the high crags. I don't call out, I don't follow. I simply watch and remember. Not every rescue is about possession. Not every connection ends in a collar or a cage. Sometimes what you save chooses to stay wild. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that wildness carries a piece of you with it. If this story touched you, let it live beyond this video. Share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself, what would you have done? Could you have let them go? And if you want to follow more stories where rescue doesn't always look the way we expect, subscribe. There's more to come.